Hi guys. So our next lesson is talking about habitat management, and we're not going to get super in depth in this unit. That's kind of for the next unit or the unit after, depending on how things shake out. But with federal land use, we already learned about conservation versus preservation. But now, why are those things important, and how do some of these lands get managed? So, just a couple of definitions that I want you guys to understand before you start your classwork is first biodiversity. So, biodiversity is the diversity or the gamut of all life that's living in an area. So, plants, fungi, animals, all of those different things, not just animals. We're also talking about plants, bacteria, everything else. The next definition is ecosystem services. So, when we think about services that an ecosystem gives us, those are giving us clean air and water. They're giving us fertile soil for crop production. They are giving us pollinators. They're giving us control from floods. So, that last one, for example, is if we have a farm field versus a natural wetlands properties are going to keep that area a lot healthier when it comes to rain and flooding. If there are a lot of wetlands that get turned into farm fields, you're going to have a lot of flooding because the soils and the root systems of those plants aren't made to soak up water. So a service that a wetland ecosystem does is, keeping us away from floods and erosion and different things like that. The next one is ecosystem resilience. So, this is if there is some sort of a natural disaster, disease, different things like that that attack an ecosystem, how well is that ecosystem going to be able to bounce back from that event? So, if there is a wildfire that's going through a stand of trees, and there is only one type of tree that lives in that area, and that tree happens to be very susceptible to fire, so it burns really easily, that is not a resilient ecosystem. It's going to burn all the trees down and nothing will be left. However, if we have more biodiversity of trees in an area, there are some species of trees that are actually resistant to fire. Red pine is an example. So if a fire goes through that area, that is going to be a resilient ecosystem because the pines are going to stay. They're going to create like a shelter for other plants to start growing again. So the more biodiversity we have, the more resilient that ecosystem tends to be. The last one is carrying capacity. So, carrying capacity is the amount of organisms that an environment can hold. So, when we think of carrying capacity, we typically are going to think about animals with our carrying capacity. So, if we have a field that's 100 acres, maybe it can sustain 50 deer for a year or 100 turkeys for a year or something like that. If we get more of those animals in, we're going to have a little bit of a bad situation. So, what you guys are going to do is we are going to learn about fragmentation. So, in habitat fragmentation, what is happening here is habitats are being broken up. So, when we're talking about federal lands, what they strive to do is to unfragment these different habitats for better management. So, for example, if we use the pictures that are down below, if I have the large habitat that is on the left side of the screen, I can better manage the plants, the animals, all those things in that area. If you look at the one on the right hand side, so the one right down here, if I have two different federal lands with private land in between, that now becomes a management issue because I cannot necessarily control the animals that go from place to place. The amount of species and the biodiversity actually goes down the smaller little parts of habitat that we have. So, what happens with a lot of federal land in a lot of areas is they will try to manage all of these little patches, patchiness of land. It becomes very difficult. And that's why it's really important for the federal government to work with private landowners to give them incentives to work with them in order to manage the habitat. So what you are going to be working on now is this data dive. So you're going to be working on this in class. You're going to be looking at this data. This is actually from an experiment that was done to study this habitat fragmentation, is looking at what corridors can actually do for habitats. So there was a mossy rock experiment where we have some moss on a rock and we have little broken off pieces of moss. Some are isolated, but some have a corridor or like a little hallway sort of thing that goes back to the mainland of moss. And what you guys are going to do is read through this background and answer the questions down below to kind of understand a little bit more about this habitat fragmentation. So when we're back to talking about fragmentation, we're also going to be looking at the edge of the habitat. So that's how much border a habitat area has. And that becomes really, really important because that area of a habitat is often very, very biodiverse. This is called the detrimental edge. So the habitat edge is usually the most damaged by fragmentation because obviously stuff can get to the edge. So for example, it's going to be most likely to have disease. So for example, emerald ash borer is going to hit the edge of a forest before it actually gets to the middle. That edge, especially if it's the edge between like a prairie and a woods, is going to have the greatest temperature changes that can be bad for a species. It's going to have the most invasive species affected by pollution, storms, all of those different things. So this mossy rock experiment, the background in that data dive talks about this, so you guys can read through this. But what we kind of discovered by doing this is that adding in these corridors when we're actually managing these habitats really, really helps with our management. Insects can go between these corridors, but on the mossy rock, but when we're talking about huge expanses of land, if I have a national park here that I'm protecting, and then a national forest here, and in the middle, like where my face is, that's all private land, animals don't know that. And they want to go back and forth between. So that's why the federal government needs to work with private landowners to figure out how to manage these lands to make corridors so animals can move from place to place. So what this mossy rock experiment did is after 6 months, species that were in these large fragments were unaffected. They were living their lives, doing whatever. And then habitat fragmentation showed a universal decline in the number of species, the more patchy their ecosystem was. So it was more likely for those species to go extinct. So, some problems that are created by fragmentation are the decrease of population size. Less habitat lowers carrying capacity. This can also lead to inbreeding. So, if you have little tiny ecosystems that are patchy all over the place and they can't move between, those animals or plants are going to inbreed with each other. We're changing the physical environment, increased risk of extinction. You guys can read through the rest of the stuff. It is really, really detrimental. Some causes of these habitat fragmentations are human development. So, urban sprawl, but also a lot of farmland can cause habitat fragmentation as well. One of the biggest ways that humans are causing habitat fragmentation is also road building. So, what happens when we build a road through an area is you are creating a huge Frogger like danger zone for animals to move from place to place. It also creates really easy access for predators to get from area to area. So if you are an herbivore that is along a roadway, it's a lot easier for a predator to get to you than if you are in a thick, dense understory or underbrush. We are increasing vehicle collisions, all of those different things. As well, the sides of the road, if you see the picture down below, can really, really be damaged because now we created an edge to our ecosystem as well. So one thing that I want to show you guys, I'm going to actually flip to a website. So this website is Wildlife Crossings in Wyoming. So if you look at the picture down below, you see elk that are just crossing a road. I don't know about you, but if you've ever hit a deer with your car, you definitely do not want to hit an elk because they are bigger. Some of them can be the size of a small horse, and you will really, really mess up your car. So this was a really huge effort in the state of Wyoming because annually there are an average of, it says here, 6,000 collisions with big game, resulting in 20 to $23 million in wildlife costs and a little bit more than that in personal injury costs. So the Department of Game and Fish, as well as the Wyoming DOT, they really, really took action and they did some really, really cool stuff. So what they did is, if you look on this map here of Wyoming, all of these blue areas are wildlife crossing zones in Wyoming. It's a really, really cool thing that they are doing. So let me show you guys a picture of what these wildlife crossing zones look like. So what these look like is big long fences that go along the highways with things called jump outs. So what this is a huge mound of dirt that, here, this is the road right down here where my little cursor is going. The deer, see here, mule deer, from the highway can jump out across away from the highway, but it's too tall for them to jump back onto the highway. So it's a really, really cool thing that they're able to do in order to keep these animals off of the road. But what you may be asking yourself is, if they're doing this, they're now creating a fragmentation. What Wyoming Game and Fish has done is they've actually created bridges and underpasses specifically for wildlife to use. So this is a picture from an area called Trappers Point. And here you can see that the highway goes under here. And then above, there are land bridges that these wildlife can use. So what they did is they took roadkill data of where most of these animals were being hit and what species of animals were being hit. And then that's where they put in these overpasses. So they've created a corridor to help manage. So that's one of the things that habitat fragmentation can be solved by people, but of course it would be solved by not having roads and just letting the animals run free. But of course we can't necessarily do that in the society that we currently have. So here's a quick little video for you guys to watch.
You can see a lot of wildlife from Wyoming's roads, but when wildlife is on the road, sometimes we see it after it's too late. Despite drivers' best efforts to avoid hitting wildlife, collisions account for millions of dollars in property damage, human lives lost, and the loss of thousands of big game animals. In total, these collisions cost $50 million annually. We can prevent wildlife vehicle collisions. Underpasses and overpasses work well with migrating animals that cross roadways in the same places year after year. Highway underpasses and overpasses, coupled with fencing, can reduce crashes by 80 to 90% and ensure these animals can safely cross roads to get to seasonal ranges. But it's not only about overpasses and underpasses. Roads divide seasonal ranges in some areas, forcing deer to cross the highway daily to make the most of their habitat. Since deer don't cross roads in the same place every time while on summer or winter range, the safety of many miles of road depends on other improvements. Roadway studies show that variable speed limit signs and dynamic movable signs that warn drivers of wildlife on the road help drivers slow down, reducing accidents. Modifications like mowing the right-of-way and changing the shoulder slope can improve visibility and keep deer further away from roads. If animals do end up on the road in front of a vehicle, then changes to fences can allow wildlife to escape quickly without getting hung up. Wyoming is coming together to address the concern of wildlife vehicle-related crashes. A 2017 Wildlife and Roadway Summit identified 240 sites that could receive funding for large construction projects like overpasses or smaller projects like wildlife fencing or signs. From that list, 40 locations, known as statewide sites, were noted as areas of greatest concern for wildlife and motorists. Work has begun on several of these projects, but there's still a lot more to do. Tackling these projects holds promise for both motorists and wildlife, and locally driven processes have generated an action plan for Wyoming. The plan is in place, but sustainable and reliable funding is a critical component to putting solutions on the roads to save $50 million and thousands of animals annually.
So, for an example of this in Wisconsin, because we don't have wildlife corridors, what our state has done is really, really helped with logging to make vast expanses of wilderness in areas of Wisconsin. So, early in Wisconsin's history, we deforested much of the land in order to build different things and whatnot. And this was really poorly planned out, and a lot of areas were clear cut. So it got rid of a lot of biodiversity, got rid of a lot of species. So, what we can do is we can actually look at these different forests and plant new trees, make corridors, and different things like that in these areas. What these different federal organizations can do is look at a farm field and say to a farmer, hey, let's not plow a strip of land between this forest and this forest so animals can go freely through that area. And then pretty soon succession will take over and little trees will begin to grow and different things like that. So lots and lots of different things can happen in order to unfragment the land, but it takes organization and cooperation between the federal government and private landowners. So, in your next lesson, when we start talking about the different organizations that do these things, we'll talk a little bit about why that can be a little tricky sometimes.